Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to be here with you again this year. I was here last year. That's probably why 50% of you just leapt up and went out to get a coffee, because you thought we've heard him once and that's enough in anyone's lifetime. But this one's a little bit different from last year. Last year I talked about bees and queens and drones and how things are made up. This year I'm going to talk differently, but in similar vein to what Martin just said, and so we'll test you later to see if you see if you can see the similarities in our two talks. I'm not going to talk about the specifics of innovation, obviously. I will talk a little bit more about the prerequisites for innovation and the context within which innovation can occur or should occur, and draw on some lessons from my recent past, which will draw on education and draw on science. I will talk a bit about science because I know something about it, and I will do so not because I think it's critical or you can't have innovation without it, because clearly you can. But it is true that I know more about it and the associations and the issues associated with it. But I think also primarily because there are lessons that we can draw from how we've handled science and innovation in this country. And I think that they cross many areas and intrude those lessons into policy development. I remind you at the beginning of a statement that Noel Pearson made at the National Press Club earlier this year. And he said, and I quote, to paraphrase the great one, I don't know who he was talking about, to paraphrase the great one, every galah and every pet shop is talking innovation. What he didn't say then was that we just emerged, until last Saturday at least, from a period when the very word innovation was effectively banned. I know from personal experience that a paper that used it would come back with a substitute handwritten over the crossed out word innovation. So the landscape, or maybe just the wordscape, we'll see, changed, but the challenges haven't. And for me there is a big challenge. How do we get change in Australia that will secure our future? How do we build an Australia that we want and that gives all our citizens the sense of there being something in the change for them too? There are people who still think about what we used to call the fair go, and we still do, although there aren't too many people, I think, in the polity of Australia that actually understand what that means. But for most people, what that means is that you get opportunity in this country, regardless of where you live and regardless of the circumstances into which you were born. That's a fair go, and that's the sort of Australia we should be trying to build. So how do we build an Australia that does not just look after those with the wherewithal to benefit, the capacity to make more money, to get the big house on the hill that overlooks and of course looks over the park where people live in cardboard boxes? How do we persuade people that this is not just a comfortable me talking to you, the choir, what we now pejoratively call the elite? But rather, when we talk, we must show, how do we show, that we also have in mind an aim, the building of our particular part, the small part that we might play, but the small but important part that we might play, and fit it in with all the other parts that will make of this Australia the country we want it to be. Oh, how's that? Sorry about that. Do you want me to start again, or? Could give it a go if I can remember. I am. If Grandmaster signals age, only age. Anyway, so how do we make sure that the part that we're involved in building fits in with all the other parts that will make Australia the country we want it to be? Prosperous, fair, equitable, tolerant. So today I'm going to talk about complex systems with specific parts. Last week I had the pleasure of visiting the dentist to have a wisdom tooth extracted that was cracked to the root. It had to be cut into 3 pieces and taken out piece by piece. So I can answer the question that many of you have asked, I'm sure. By comparison with having a wisdom tooth extracted, how does listening to the current policy debate compare? I won't say which I prefer, but if there were a public opinion poll, it'd be 50-50. So there I was in the chair lying back, listening to the whir of the drill and the snap of the rubber glove, and it occurred to me that the distance between dentistry and public policy is not so great. It's remarkable what you think about when you're in a position like that. But I realised that dental surgeons and departmental secretaries might have a great deal more in common than we think, although it's true probably that we like one of them more than the other. But both of them deal with a very specific part of a very complex system. They know quite well that the part that they work on is affected by the health of the other parts, but those other parts are more often than not someone else's problem. The dentist would say it's not good practice to overstep your expertise. The secretary would say it's not good politics to exceed your mandate. The outcome is the same. Very bright people with a very specific and a defined and sometimes narrow brief. I would say that, or should say that you appreciate the similarities all the more when you reach my stage of life. You look back on your dealings with many secretaries over the years, many ministers indeed, and prime ministers, and you spend a great deal of time in the company, or at least in the waiting room, of very expensive medical specialists. And you realise a few of these people, initially at least, very few of these people are really talking to each other or thinking about the issue in the way you do, as a place where their responsibilities overlap. So at least when it comes to my health, there is a coordinating agent, and that's me. At least I can read the instructions on the bottle that tell me how many pills I'm supposed to take and when, and that gives me a distinct advantage over the 50% of the population who can't follow simple dosing instructions according to the National Health Literacy Survey in a developed country like this where people are supposed to go to school. Fair go, opportunity, regardless of where you live or the circumstances into which you were born. How can we tolerate an education system that lets that happen and say that we're the country of the fair go? Opportunity. But I also have an interest, a certain interest in planning for the long haul, because I want to be around in a decade's time and I would much prefer to be around in good health. So if we compare that to the situation for Australia, who coordinates the body of politic? Who has a mandate to think beyond the parts to the way those parts work together to make up a country? Or as I've said elsewhere, how do we distinguish between ends and means and avoid seeing each component as an end in itself? We must have a good health policy, but we have a good health policy for a purpose. We must have a good defence policy, but we have it for a purpose. We should have a good education policy for a purpose. They're all bricks in the wall, if the wall is Australia. Now, I don't think it's always clear who has that coordinating responsibility. You might say it's the government. But just between you and me and in the confidence of this room, that's not always been my experience. Not often my experience. And I would just give you one simple example, but I could give you 100. As one example, research and development in Australia is funded through 14 portfolios and through around about 150 programs. Does it work as well as it could? As well as it should? As well as we need it to? No. One area to illustrate. You might be working in a particular area that needs more research done. You need more PhD students. So that policy might be developed in Area 1, but in Area 2 they have the policy that governs how many PhD students we have. And when you ask them how many are doing research in this particular area, they can't tell you for two reasons. One is that PhD students are coded by field of education, not of research. And the universities don't have to code them anyway if they don't want to, as long as they get the numbers in the table so they get the money. So the fastest growing PhD enrolment category in Australia over the last 5-10 years has been not otherwise classified. So you can't find out. Whose responsibility is it? It's not the person who needs them. It's the department that looks after the data and sends out the money. Is that the best we can do? Surely not. So it's a problem when it comes to things like science and innovation because it cuts across all portfolios. It's complicated, it's messy, and it's essential, just like policy. And science isn't like some organ that you can cut out and be rid of without too much bother. It's more like the central nervous system, a network with a lot of complicated bits interacting in complicated ways. It depends on the attitudes and skills developed in schools, the opportunities created by industry, the training and experiences in universities, the funding for research and research infrastructure, the intellectual property laws, the tax laws, the international partnerships, and a whole host of other variables. Change any one of those things and the consequences will be felt across the system. So try solving any of the big challenges we face as humanity without the flow of knowledge to ideas into action. Try doing it without multiple areas of expertise working closely together in the sciences, the technologies, the engineering, mathematics, social sciences and humanities. Try doing it without leadership from government. So who is it who keeps the brain cells firing and who makes sure the brain connects to all the muscles and joints that have to execute the plans? Some people, by which I mean some economists, will tell you that the answer is pretty simple. Wait for the market to sort it out. It used to happen back in the old days, so it will again. And the market logic when it comes to science and research is basically that if it needs to be funded, industry will do it. And if industry doesn't fund it, it doesn't need to be done. If bits of science die and take large chunks of the economy with them, immediately or into the future, then that's what we call progress. Now, I'm not quite sure why this logic has paralysed our thinking for as long as it has. If we looked around what's happening in other countries, we might think again about the so-called common sense that we're that's dished up to us constantly at home. Presidents or prime ministers around the world have a different prescription. If you doubt me, I invite you to visit the website of the President of the United States. Back in 2009, when he was fresh and young and his hair wasn't grey, President Obama noted that, and I quote, "Science, technology and innovation are essential to sustaining economic growth, enabling Americans to lead longer and healthier lives, limiting the harm from climate change." He declared that he would restore science to its rightful place. So the President, in the land of the free, where some in this country believe that the market rules absolutely, while they simultaneously ignore the fact that the biggest venture capital funder until recently was the United States government, or put another way, the United States taxpayer, has just posted a list of the top 100 policy interventions he's made in science, technology and innovation over his term, listing in effect how he used policy clout and government investment to drive change, having first articulated why the US needed to change. Now, there are 100 of them. If you want to know all 100 or want to learn all 100 or whatever you want to do with the 100, go to the website. But I'll just list a few of them to give you a taste. He's elevated the quality and rigour of the science, technology and innovation advice in the White House. He's connected science, technology and innovation experts and resources across the administration to address national challenges and opportunities. He's increased support for high-risk, high-reward research. He's produced the first ever national innovation strategy, which includes policies for innovation. He's made more than 180,000 federal data sets and collections available to students, entrepreneurs and the public. Things that we've talked about. Things that we say, oh, it's too hard. We can't do that. It's too hard. Woe is us. He's prioritised STEM education. He's strengthened the K-12 STEM teaching body. He's encouraged broad participation and equity in STEM education. He's supported millions of students by getting high-speed broadband into schools to connect 99% of students by 2018. He launched a national network for manufacturing innovation. He's accelerated the transition of research discoveries from lab to market, and the list goes on and on. He's created a multi-agency program to harness big data. And his vision of the role of government in industrial development is not a fringe position. It's simply the continuation of measures dating back to Eisenhower and the post-Second World War consensus. Now, we're not the US, you know that, I know that. Some of you are rolling your eyes when I use the US to illustrate. We're not the US in culture, we're not in economy, or not in size, or not in many other things. And we don't want to be the US in a number of those things, but we can learn from what they've done. And what we can learn is that good governments think about the health of the system rather than responding to breakdowns in the individual parts. And they don't just wait and see. They work out how to build their countries to the level of high-performing athletes, not like certain football clubs, but they use the benefit of evidence, the strategy, and long-term commitment. And you don't have to be big. Luxembourg has turned itself into the hub for space mining, getting the resources off the asteroids. They've done it by getting their policies in place, their laws in place, their IP laws in place, and their finance in place, decades before it's actually going to be used. South Korea's got a long-term vision for high-tech industry. They've been building it remorselessly. Focus, long-term commitment, articulated vision of how it fits in to help build the country that they want to be. So our challenge is to imagine how Australia might also be different and pursue that difference with courage and the long-haul commitment that seems to be missing today. I don't need to pick over the entrails of the election. I'd be just like everybody else who's picking over the entrails of the election. But taken in tandem with the outcome of the Brexit vote in the UK and the presidential campaign in the US, it's obvious that we have a problem. People don't like being told anymore by what is pejoratively called the elites, as I said. They don't like being told what's good for them. They don't like hearing about a great future that appears not to have a place for them or for people like them, or even a sense that it includes them. Many of them don't see that it's an exciting time to be them. Or maybe they simply don't know about that future because we only talk about it amongst ourselves, in forums like this, in rooms like this, amongst people like us. Now, I don't believe that it has to be that way. I do recognise that it's often a closed conversation, or it can appear that way when we don't bother to explain what it's really about or educate the majority of the population to a point where they can understand it. Explained accessibly but not patronisingly, or even explain why it's important to them, given that they actually pay for most of it. I also know that there are a lot of people who will make merry in that gap by denigrating, misrepresenting or marginalising, say, science, whenever it serves their interest to do so. I personally find it amazing how the very rich and powerful people so often attack science as an imagined conspiracy of rich and powerful people, and even more amazing that this charade often works. If we are to work for a healthy body politic and a high-performance athlete-like economy, then we need a sense of common purpose, how all the bits fit together to build a country, not how all the bits are themselves an end. So it has to include a sense of science as a shared concern, a collective investment in our common future, has to include a sense of policy as a shared concern, a collective investment in our common future. And the development of policy is a shared concern. The implementation of policy is a shared concern. I think that in much of what I've said, you can substitute science with policy. Many of the issues and challenges are similar, even the focus is similar, although it can be lost in both cases. During the same speech at the Press Club, Noel Pearson went on to say, and I quote, "The Prime Minister's conversation is largely focused on business and product innovation and venture capital mobilisation rather than social and policy innovation. How government can be an enabler of innovation, understanding that by itself it can never be an innovator. My concern today," he said, "is to point out that the importance of social policy innovation, something government can only enable rather than execute, and even more so policy and political innovation." I think he's right. Government is the big enabler and early investor. We can learn from the US, from China, Luxembourg, South Korea, the UK. We don't have to copy them, but we can learn from what they do. And we can learn from each other. The lessons from science apply elsewhere, just as the learning from elsewhere applies to science. We have a real need for the big picture. What sort of Australia are we doing all this for? We have also to distinguish between the means and the ends. As I've said, we can get lost in the detail and think that what we're doing is an end in itself. It isn't. It is an important part of the construction, but it's only a part, an important part. So we must have a comprehensive approach that means sharing everything from territory to data. We must rely on evidence and use it to build the capacity to influence ministerial musings. The willingness to influence ministerial musings is part of what we must do. But above all, we must have courage. I'm on time, nearly. Above all, we must have courage. Now, I know it's easy for me, somebody like me, to stand up and feel sanguine about some whippersnapper in a ministerial office who knows it all, notwithstanding that they know very little. And I know it is harder for many of you than it ever has been for me, or has, well, at this stage of my life, it used to be hard for me. But the environment that we build has to be based on that contest of ideas, and people with ideas must be supported. And when they have the courage to put their ideas forward, they have to be supported even more strongly. Because it's only through that contest will Australia get better. And only then will we have built a country that's worth handing on. Thank you.